we've got Kyle Wilhoit here from Palo Alto Networks. He's going to be talking about some false flag operations and the work that he does around this. Kyle has a decade of experience in threat intelligence research, studying attackers, their exploits, tools, and such like that. So without further ado, Kyle.
Awesome. Thank you. So, as mentioned, my name's Kyle Wilhoit. I feel like I'm at the command of the Starship Enterprise. Like we need to hit full boosters or something. I like this. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is something that I've been researching over about 2 years, a little over 2 years, and it revolves around false flags. And I know some of the individuals in this room know what false flags are, but for those of you that don't, we're going to cover that. And I'll get into the impetus behind this research here shortly. But first, I just wanted to do a quick introduction into who I am. As mentioned, I'm a principal cyber attack and exploit researcher at Palo Alto Networks. I was previously at Domain Tools, Trend Micro, FireEye, and a few other organizations. BlueHat review board member, and I was co-author on a long-titled book about ICS and SCADA security. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to shout at me or yell things, obscenities, etc. I have no problem with that. Also, I think there's a box of tomatoes in back that you all can throw at me. That's also an option. So why did I do this research? There's a few things. First, on a daily basis, I would consider myself and the team that I'm on operational threat researchers. And what I mean by that is we spend our daily basis tracking and understanding actor groups, campaigns that those actor groups are conducting, as well as malware families that they're leveraging to attack victims. We're looking for new variants of that malware, but we're also looking for possible campaigns that were leveraging old styles of malware, etc. So from our perspective, we're constantly on the front lines trying to understand precisely what these attackers and groups and campaigns are doing so we can better protect and better publish white papers, indicators, etc. to help proactively block stuff across the enterprise. Realistically, there was 4 reasons as to why I kind of came up with this research topic. First, I wanted to test out how fast could I effectively set up a false flag effort and do it cheaply and quickly. I wanted to have it done quickly and cheaply because I was curious. If I were an actor, let's say nation-state actor X, wherever they may be, I'm curious to see can they do it and how cheap can they set up these false flag efforts. Also, ideally, I wanted to throw off threat intelligence platforms, or TIP products. TIP products are typically portals that rely on analysis from other engines that helps provide kind of an overlay to data. So for instance, if I was curious in actor group A, I could type in an indicator that might relate to that actor group. It might be a domain, it might be an IP address, it might be a mutex that malware actually goes out and creates. So my idea was I wanted to throw off those platforms to automatically misattribute malware and binaries that I'm submitting to public sources to then automatically tag these with actor group X or actor group B. I also wanted to fool indicator-based intelligence collection systems. So systems that will automatically attempt to classify indicators, I wanted to fool those. I wanted to see, can I make these indicator systems believe that I'm actually submitting binaries by APT23, for instance? And then finally, kind of the biggest part of this is I wanted to mimic nation-state actor groups as well as criminal actor groups. And then I wanted to trigger detections based on the identifying features. So whatever indicators I can mimic, I wanted those particular detections to properly fire and to show back, hey, this is actor group APT23 or whatever actor group I'm trying to mimic. So that's kind of the 4 reasons as to why I had developed and kind of come up with this research concept. And I'll get into much more detail here shortly about that. From an agenda, I kind of divide this out into 5 sections. First, I kind of briefly talk about false flag operations and what those operations look like, where we may have seen them in the past, as well as different kind of concepts revolving around how false flag efforts work. Also, I'm going to be talking about common grouping and pivoting methods. These are methods that on a daily basis, myself and many other threat intelligence researchers, probably several of you in this room, are commonly using and understand on a daily basis. And I'm going to do that so you understand what individuals from an intel perspective are typically hunting through and looking for. Then I talk about a false flag recipe and how I constructed this false flag effort. Then I talk about the results and conclusions of that research. So let's go ahead and jump in. So false flag efforts. For those of you that aren't familiar, a false flag effort is done by an adversary to throw off attribution and investigators. The idea is to make individuals that are possibly researching this group or researching this activity to throw them off your tracks, to buy you more time, or to possibly even frame another actor group or campaign, etc. The ultimate objective for false flag efforts is traditionally to shift blame or muddy the water of attribution and investigation. This is done from both a military perspective, meaning oftentimes we'll see kinetic activity leveraging false flags, but it's also done in our realm, which I'll show momentarily. Ultimately, this can also be done to throw off researchers that ultimately can go down to media as well, and I'll talk about that as we get further into the presentation. And then this can be divided into what I classify as two distinct groups of false flag activity. On one side, we have blame shifting, which blame shifting is simply saying this is another group, or trying to portray my activity as another group. There was one specific case that some North Korean attackers a couple years ago, during the Sony attack, they had actually gone out and released that a group had been responsible for that attack, and they were actually at that time calling themselves the Guardians of Peace, and they went by another name as well, but they were trying to shift that blame from possible nation-state attribution to North Korea off to a possible group at that point. Group emulation is a little bit different. That's emulating a nation-state or criminal group to make it look like the activity that you're performing is actually that group. And I'll show some examples of that coming up. Some classic examples. Cyber Caliphate is one of them. And this is not to be confused with the United Cyber Caliphate, who I've done a considerable amount of research on. The Cyber Caliphate, at the time of the attacks that they were performing 2 to 3 years ago, they were essentially, at that time, called a pro-ISIS arm that were carrying out cyber attacks in the name of ISIS. In this case, they had attacked 2 different organizations. One was TV5 Monde in France, and another one was a defacement of U.S. CENTCOM. They also had some PII leaks where they had cracked some sites and taken some PII and leaked that, but that's not too important. Ultimately, attribution was called into question here because there was infrastructure bleed over with a common group called SOFICI or APT28 or the guys that hacked the elections, whatever you want to call them. Second piece is Olympic Destroyer, which I know was talked about a little bit earlier today. This was an attack that happened not that long ago, actually, whenever the Olympics in Pyeongchang were actually going on. All signs at that point had pointed to North Korea, but there were indicators spread throughout the campaign as well as the malware itself that were pointing to Chinese as well as other actor groups. So from our perspective, meaning from an intel perspective, it's hard for us to say, is this a false flag effort? And can we trust basic attribution on these things? Third is Cloud Atlas. I couldn't find a really snazzy image for Cloud Atlas, so I just took a Tom Hanks photo, and that movie's really awful. So that this doesn't condone my my selection for movies, by the way. Cloud Atlas was published in 2014. I won't mention by who. They were supposedly at the time Eastern European, but some researchers had gone out and done a lot of attribution looking at the infrastructure, looking at the actual files that they were using, and it was spread out across the board. There was APKs, for instance, that were written in Hindi. There was Arabic. There was multiple file attributes as well as language attributes spread across their entire campaign that made attribution nearly impossible, but also called into question that is this a false flag effort? So these are 3 common cases of false flags that we might be seeing on a daily basis, and more than likely, to some degree, false flags were involved in these cases. Now I'm going to talk about common grouping and pivoting methodologies. Traditionally speaking, how researchers or threat intelligence researchers like myself source information is through a multitude of different ways. The first and foremost, most important data point for me is internal telemetry data. And when I say internal telemetry data, I'm referring to internal data, in my case, at Palo Alto. whereas in Microsoft, it would be Microsoft data. That's a wealth of information that many researchers likely don't have, and it gives us great information as to possible targeting, as to who and when they were active, meaning the attackers when they were active. It also gives us a wealth of information to be able to look for new attack activity. It might be malware, it might be groups, it might be campaigns. But that's one major source that I often rely on. VirusTotal and other online malware repositories are obviously popular as well. I myself have been sourcing intel off VirusTotal for years, and I know several of you in this room have also done that. And the functionality behind VirusTotal and other malware repositories makes sense, and it makes sense as to why we source information from there. Online malware sandboxes, this could be like any run or any online sandbox where we can submit files, let it execute, and see what it does. A lot of those online sandboxes allow us to have an API tie-in that we can actually pull samples down as they get submitted, so then we can also analyze those in our own environments. And then finally, from our perspective, I like looking at blogs and other open source intelligence locations. Industry blogs are great for us to source intel from because I can take an indicator and immediately start to pivot, looking for additional infrastructure, additional malware, additional campaigns, etc. So I just wanted to give kind of a quick overview of how intel researchers will typically source information. This is by no means an all-encompassing list, but it is something to keep in mind that there are a multitude of different ways that we source information, and I'm not including in this case, for instance, correlating with other industries such as Microsoft, etc. One thing I like to talk about is kind of general grouping and pivot points. What I'm trying to show here is that we have two independent or possibly independent campaigns and actor groups. Those are the red circles. I think those are red. I'm colorblind, so I think, is that red? Okay. Those two red circles, what I'm trying to show is those could be independent activity, so it could be an individual malware family that's not necessarily tied to a campaign or an actor group, or they could be related. And the relations between those two campaigns, actor groups, or malware families traditionally falls into one of three sections. The first is C2 infrastructure similarities. And what I'm looking for here is the actor group, campaign, or malware family sharing the same C2 infrastructure? That might be domain or that might be IP address. It could also be subnets, depending upon where it's located and how it's leveraged. But C2 infrastructure is huge for us to be able to pivot on and correlate actor groups, malware families, and campaigns. And then on the bottom side, I'm really kind of focusing on the malware piece. Code similarities between these possible malware families is big. And then functional execution similarities. What I'm considering there is registry modifications when that malware is executed, file activity. It could also be mutexes that are created when that malware is executed on the host, those types of things. So I'm looking for dynamic execution similarities because those are, in many cases, distinctly different than code similarities that might be PDB paths, something like that, embedded statically that we have to reverse engineer and pull out and start to pivot on from that. So what I'm trying to show here is that while there could be two independent clusters of activity, such as the red circles, there's also several cases where those can overlap, and these are broadly how we look at those pieces in overlap and correlate all of that data together. If I were to look at it a little bit closer, if we were to pivot on malware, for instance, let's say that we have three independent pieces of malware that I'm investigating. I have a gut feel that they're similar in nature, but I ultimately have to look through and correlate many pieces of information to tie all three of these malware families together. And I'm giving just an example here of different pivot points from within malware that we can use and leverage to be able to then correlate and group these clusters of activity together. So again, this is by no means an all-encompassing list. This is just merely an example. But if we were to look at this, we could say, if we have static file attributes, PDB paths, strings, all the basic stuff that you would get when you statically reverse engineer a sample, C2 could be protocol utilization, could be domain, IP, could be URI path from the actual communications, etc. Dynamic file activity is during execution of malware, mutex, PDB paths, etc. If those five pieces of information, or five indicators to me, overlap to some degree with malware sample 1, I can start to say they're tied together somehow. It might be code reuse, sure. But again, that depends on the case and what we're looking at. If it's a cyber criminal or a group that's probably cyber criminal in nature, we're probably going to start looking and saying this is possibly code reuse as opposed to just a variant of a family that this particular group has been using over the years. From a pivot on domain, this is similar in nature to how malware is work, how we pivot and group on malware. In this case, we have two different domains. And in those specific domains, what I'm looking for is not only grouping and pivoting to try to find malware possibly or tools that are associated, but I'm also trying to cluster that activity to say that maybe domain 1 and domain 2 are related to the same actor group or campaign. And they oftentimes will use malware family 1, for instance. And I'm genericizing malware 1 and domain just to give you the idea of how, from a daily basis, we go out and pivot on this information. And it'll make sense as to why I'm covering this on the back side of the presentation. I'm not just trying to bore you, I promise. And then another example is grouping on actor or campaign. So this is looking a little bit more broadly, not looking directly at malware, not looking directly at domains. And in this case, it's kind of similar in nature. We have campaigns on one side, actors on the other, and then indicators that are kind of in the middle. Those shared indicators can help lead us to, are these is this an overlapping campaign? Is this an overlapping actor? Is this a new variant of an old malware family? What are we looking at? So ultimately, from our perspective, if we can start to tie all of this activity together on shared indicators or shared properties, it starts to allow us to classify this stuff better. And it makes us understand kind of how these actor groups are changing their TTPs on a daily basis and how they're constantly modifying and changing what they're doing. So now I'll get into the fun stuff. And this is where I start to talk about, as I was going through this investigation or this research, I decided I had to come up with some groundwork and concerns that I had to address before I even started going through this process of making these campaigns. And I call this false flag recipe because realistically, these are all items that I had to consider as I was going through the creation of this campaign. The first is infrastructure considerations. I had to understand and realize and look at what are actor groups doing from an infrastructure perspective and how are they doing it and how are they changing. From my perspective, domain reuse is easy, meaning I can go out to a public blog for any actor group that's been published on. I'll pull an indicator from there, an old domain. I'll go out and look at the registration properties. I can mirror the registrant information. I can re-register that domain, and I've effectively created my own C2 that then can be tipped off in tip products. No pun intended. Also, I realized that matching that domain registrar and registrant information, depending upon, again, location, where you're hosting it, etc., is super trivial. Meaning it's super easy to go out and clone that information, pull up another email address, register their domain with that, and move on. Super, super easy. Also, IP infrastructure for the most part is irrelevant, primarily because that's constantly migrating with actor group, with tool, with campaign, etc. So the IP infrastructure wasn't hugely important for me. Where I was hosting these files or how you were hosting these files, how these false flag efforts get executed with specific IP infrastructure, again, wasn't hugely relevant for me, which was nice because it opened me up to more possibilities of where to host this information at. And then you can pull historical whois records for domains that you're interested in and quickly start to build up a category or a Rolodex, for a lack of a better term, of previous actors that then you can go out and mimic. So from an infrastructure perspective, very easy to do. Infection vectors. If I were going out and I was going to create a false flag campaign of some sort, I had to think about the actual infection vectors. First of all, it's very easy to create and craft a fake phishing email to make it look like it's targeting another, it could be a nation state, could be an entity within a nation state. And if you submit that to public repositories, VirusTotal, it's very easy then to start to see how that information can kind of get out of hand. And I'll get into some of that a little bit later in the presentation. It's also very easy to attribute. And what I mean by that is many Intel analysts that I've talked to and worked with, if they see an email like this, and I'm just giving one example, and this is from VirusTotal, If they see one email, they're automatically going to jump to conclusions as to victimologies, to tasking of that group, who that group could possibly be, who the malware family or what malware family is being leveraged, all of those things. So it's very easy at this point from an infection vector perspective to attribute who those actor groups are, who they possibly could be, and who they're targeting. So it's important for me to understand that, because if I'm creating this, I need to understand how to make it look like someone's been infected. It's easy to forge headers within these fake emails. It's easy to create and mimic macro functionality within dropper documents to go out for stage 2 and pull down additional tools, etc. It's super easy to do all this stuff. So at this point, I started to say, infrastructure is easy, infection vectors are easy. What about malware and payloads? In this case, super easy as well. It's easy to leverage malware that's specifically used by a group or campaign. And this is done meaning it's easy for us to ascertain what these groups are leveraging, not only based on open source intelligence from maybe industry blogs or papers, things like that, but also from our own research, right? Tracking these malware families and understanding the functionality and writing your rules for that and pivoting out based on that information. So at that point I said, okay, it's pretty easy. It's easy to alter timestamps. So if I wanted to fit my campaign within a specific area of time that matched my previous infection vector, super easy to do. It's also very easy to fake static indicators, and I made a short list here of different things that you can make indicators on, all of which we can trigger off of via YARA rules, via IPS signatures, via IDS signatures, basically any kind of proactive protection mechanism. We can then start to throw off indicators such as that. So at this point I said, okay, infrastructure is good, malware is good, we can keep going. Intended targets. This is also very easy to do. It's also very easy for analysts to immediately, as I mentioned earlier, cluster based on that target. So they'll say, okay, the government of Bahrain is being targeted. Let's look at other targets that are or other actors or campaigns that are also targeting that government and automatically start to lump that activity together. That's really bad and also not a good way to cluster activity. So it's easy to be able to throw off some of the investigative techniques just by altering some of these things and kind of lining them up a little bit closer. And then, as many of us are familiar with, and myself included, many researchers will jump to conclusions based on confirmation bias. This is common, and I think many people that perform any type of intelligence work, they truly understand that confirmation bias exists, and it's something that we constantly have to combat. But if I was on the other side of that coin and I was creating a false flag, this is a perfect opportunity for me to be able to kind of prey on researchers that automatically assume confirmation bias. So it kind of gives me a leg up whenever if I'm creating these campaigns. Public file distribution. This is the piece that made me the most nervous. And what I mean is, it's easy for us to do all the things that we've done that I've talked about prior to this, creating malware, registering infrastructure, submitting that infrastructure, doing all of kind of the campaign creation pieces. But from a public file distribution perspective, it's easy for us to submit one of these files to a public repository, VirusTotal for instance, and that's just one example. I'm not knocking VirusTotal. If we submit that file to them, researchers that have access to VirusTotal intelligence, that portal, will be able to then very quickly be able to find this file, this possible spear phishing file or email, and be able to then look at it and understand what's going on with that. The way that I view this is once you submit that file to VirusTotal or any of the sandboxes online, etc., that file is public at that point. You might as well consider it going public. There's going to be a researcher that's going to likely look at that based on signatures that are triggered. And more than likely, at some point, a blog could be written on that information. And then the media could ultimately pick that up. That's a traditional life cycle for this kind of information. And ultimately, that was a question I had. But I asked myself towards the end of this kind of research is, should I even do that, right? Should I even submit these files to VirusTotal? Because ultimately, from my perspective, I looked at it as a legal concern. And I'll get into that towards the end of the presentation. And I'm not going to tell you right now if I did submit these files publicly yet. You'll have to wait until the end. I won't be calling out anybody or anything, so don't worry about that. And then finally, the other piece that I had to take into account was detection. So I have to look at it from the other side of the coin, meaning how do threat researchers go out and detect these specific malware families? How do they detect campaigns? How do we look at all of this and correlate this? One easy thing that I started to do was I would go out and locate industry standard YARA rules. And by industry standard, what I'm referring to is YARA rules that are traditionally traded and or distributed on closed groups. I'm not going to get into any detail about those groups themselves, but oftentimes YARA rules are written and exchanged on some of these groups. It's also several thousands of YARA rules are available on GitHub and across several different public repos, so you can pull a lot of those as well. It's easy to go out and pull those YARA rules and start to then write malware or write your campaign or actor group that you're mimicking to match YARA rules that you know will then be triggered, if that makes sense. So basically, I could go out and say APT28 commonly uses infection method XYZ. I go out, look at YARA rules that are commonly used across the industry, and then I mimic that to purposely trigger those rules to throw off attribution. So I looked at it from the other side of saying, how do we detect that as researchers? And I wanted to fit everything that I was creating to those detection mechanisms. It's also easy to leverage public and private reports to be able to pull and provide source information and source indicators. It's kind of similar to what I mentioned from a blog perspective. If I go out to a public blog from FireEye, for instance, I pull down an indicator, I can then use that as a possible starting point to then use and create my own false flag effort. Some of the indicators that I'll show whenever I actually go through the false flag that I created, you'll see that I'm actually, in some cases, literally going out to public blogs, looking through their indicator set, finding old domains, and re-registering them, matching the registrant information. And I'll show you that example. But that's a great source for individuals that are performing false flag efforts, public blogs, etc. It's also easy to seed the malware and the infrastructure that the malware is leveraging in a way to provide false attribution and metadata tagging. Again, I'll show that in a few minutes. So now let's talk about the fun stuff, which is the actual results of this research. As I mentioned before, I did have some pretty firm objectives. And once I developed those objectives, I then decided to look at who did I want to mimic. Ideally, I wanted to mimic two different classifications or two different subsets of actor groups. On one side, I wanted to mimic, I hate this term, but I have to use it, APT groups. I can't believe I said that. But I wanted to mimic two distinct nation-state actor groups that were involved in espionage in some fashion. In this case, I found two wonderful candidates for that, and I'll talk about them in greater detail in a few minutes. Keyboy being one of them, and Ocean Lotus being the other. And I'll talk about other names for those groups, for those of you that aren't familiar with maybe these naming nomenclatures. I'll talk about who they are momentarily. And then the other side of that was mimicking what we would consider more of a criminal group. And in this case, I was going and I wanted to mimic a common group called Gaza Cyber Gang, otherwise known as Gaza Hacker Team and several other names that they go by. So first things first, Keyboy. This is one of those situations where Tom Hanks' picture comes into play. Wasn't any good APT-23 pictures, so I just picked the top one. It has no bearing on this slide whatsoever. So, yeah, there's always that. Yeah. So, from a Keyboy perspective, there's a supposed Chinese nexus behind Keyboy. And I say supposed because attribution sucks. So I'm just saying supposed Chinese nexus. They've been active since as early as 2013, possibly earlier. And they've been known to target Southeast Asia, Asia as a whole, and they've slowly migrated west, going into Europe. From our perspective as researchers, we oftentimes can detect Keyboy activity based on several things. First is network traffic. That also kind of ties into C2 domain and C2 communications that their tools and malware they're running is actually using. PlugX, which is a fairly common malware, not only malware builder, but also malware tool. And they were heavily and still heavily use PlugX. Imp hashes for the actual malware files themselves, and then file activity related to that malware. So we can detect based on multiple things. And I actually go into a little bit more detail here as to what I was what I was explicitly going out and looking to trigger YARA rules with. In this case, I was looking for plugx, so I wanted to go out and find, can I build the piece of malware with plugx just the way Keyboy does? That was my first objective. Then I had to go out and mimic several additional pieces of information. First of all, the C2 URI was standardized, as you can see. I kind of standardized it there. They also had specific URLs and domains that they were leveraging throughout all their campaigns, and I wanted to find one domain that they were leveraging, and I used that. Also, mutex creation was something else that I was mimicking or going out and essentially mirroring. And then a couple different registry changes that I was particularly interested in mimicking as well. And a combination of not just these pieces, but also these 5 here, I knew I could then start to throw off threat intelligence platforms like an Alien Vault, threat intel platforms like that. And again, I'm not saying anything bad about Alien Vault. They're literally aggregating data. But in this case, it's important for us to understand kind of why I was looking at it this way. After I had kind of determined what I needed to create from a malware perspective, I wanted to go out and find infrastructure. In this case, I went out publicly, and we're tracking multiple domains, multiple IPs related directly to Keyboy internally. But I wanted to go out publicly and find a domain that was published publicly on, that was directly related to Keyboy. And I did that because I knew at that point, if it was publicly reported, that the likelihood that that information was in a threat intel product was pretty high. So I figured, okay, at that point, I'm closing that chain. In this case, I found one specific domain that I liked. There were several available, but there was one specific domain that I liked that I think some of you are probably familiar with if you've ever researched this group. And this particular domain, I went out and registered the exact same way that Keyboy did. Went to Namecheap, opened up a Gmail account, the Gmail account that they were using at the time. I think this domain, at the time, I think it was about 2 years old. So I went back and literally cloned the registrant information to make it look exactly like it was Keyboy. I then went out and found a recent version of plugx, which was a giant pain in the ass, by the way. If anybody needs a plugx builder, please let me know. It was a nightmare to get. Or a new plugx builder. There's old ones, they're all garbage. This plugx builder I went out and found, and after multiple trials and errors, because I don't speak Chinese, I was able to then go out and build the malware properly and build it the way that I wanted. I ran it on our internal sandbox, and this is just one of many different sandboxes, but I think everyone recognizes what this is. And you can see there's C2 comms with a similar URI structure, so that matches. So just on C2 infrastructure, it would have matched. Then from a YARA perspective, I went out, ran these samples against internal YARA rules that we've developed, as well as external industry standard YARA rules. And in every case, it was triggering on not only Keyboy activity, but also on some obscure campaign activity that was published about 2 years ago. So in this case, I can say without a shadow of a doubt that that campaign, if I were to have gone out and dropped that binary, for instance, into VirusTotal, it more than likely would have been looked at by researchers, possibly even evolving into a blog of some sort. The second group is Ocean Lotus. They did have a snazzy graphic that I was able to snag, so that was good. No Tom Hanks or some ABC show that I've never heard of. Ocean Lotus is also known as APT32, for those of you that follow the FireEye naming conventions. They have a supposed Vietnamese nexus. Again, I say supposed because of attribution issues. They've been active since supposedly 2012. There's some debate about that. And they target worldwide multiple countries and entities across the globe, both from a governmental perspective, but also from a private industry perspective. So they're kind of all-encompassing. They like to target and own everything. You'll see some similarities here, meaning the ways that we determine and detect Ocean Lotus are similar to what we would do with any other actor group or malware family. In this case, we detect it via network traffic, C2 infrastructure setup, C2 domains specifically, and in this case, there's one domain that I had that I was interested in. And then obviously registry activity and process activity related to the malware that Ocean Lotus uses on a daily basis. Ocean Lotus uses a combination of multiple tools whenever they go out and operate. they use several custom-made tools that makes it nearly impossible for me to go out and recreate and mimic. Primarily because I don't have the tool sets. I can reverse engineer it all day long, but the problem is I wanted to do it quickly. If you remember, one of my first objectives was how fast and how quick and how cheap can I do this? So right off the bat, using a custom tool that Ocean Lotus had developed 2 years back wasn't really going to be an option. So luckily, as I started to investigate kind of a little bit more functionally how Ocean Lotus was performing their activity, I noticed that they use Cobalt Strike pretty heavily, which was good, because from my perspective, to throw together a Cobalt Strike binary in a matter of seconds takes nothing. So I looked at it like, this is a win. It's super fast, super easy. I can create this, submit it publicly, and there you go. Attribution's done for us. Ocean Lotus TTPs are super easy to track, as I've kind of mentioned, similar to what we've seen with other groups. And these are some of the things that I was directly mirroring. In this case, specific registry changes that some of the Cobalt Strike binaries were actually going out and modifying. I mentioned the domain that I was curious in setting up as infrastructure. My first step when I was creating these false flag efforts was to register infrastructure first. And I did that because if I didn't have infrastructure to do command and control communications with my binary or the victims, I have to have infrastructure first. That's the first thing. So I went out to a report published by Cybereason, and I'd pulled the domain directly from their report. So I'd literally combed through their domain report, all their indicators, looking through all their domains, and found this specific domain that was not registered. They had lapsed, I think, 6 or 8 months prior to when I registered it. So at that point, I went out and did what I did before. Registered the domain, mimicked exactly how they set up their infrastructure in the past. And then I went out, Cobalt Strike, generated the binary to match the exact TTPs, not exact, but to match to a certain degree the TTPs that they were using in the past. Executed the malware within our sandbox. Obviously, we see network traffic. And I was ultimately able to pivot and snag via Yara. I was able to trigger rule sets to say, yes, this is in fact Ocean Lotus, and this is in fact one specific variant of Cobalt Strike that they're using based on the C2 infrastructure. So at this point, I said, okay, if I submit these files, again, the same end result's probably going to happen, right? Researchers are going to look at it, and it might end up in a blog post, it might not, really no way of knowing. The final group that I kind of mimicked was Gaza Cyber Gang. They've also been active since at least 2012. Again, there's some discussions about timing on that. But these are traditionally cyber criminals or quote-unquote activists that are obviously and traditionally targeting Middle Eastern nation states. They most recently were involved in an attack against Palestinian law enforcement and government officials, which was pretty interesting. They're known for using a few commodity rats, one of which was Quasar Rat, another Downix, several other malware families. And as we've seen before, a lot of the indicators that we're detecting Gaza Cyber Gang with are easily replaceable and easily mimicable. I went out to Alien Vault, pulled down some Gaza Cyber Gang indicators. I went and downloaded a fairly recent version of Quasar Rat, the actual builder itself, used the domain that I registered that Gaza Cyber Gang was using in operations for a couple years. I generated the malware. I registered the infrastructure, again, identically, as close as possible to the previous infrastructure. Then I executed it. Saw some C2 communication matching the query that we would see, therefore triggering Yara rules as well as IPS IDS signatures if they exist. So in this case, again, I'm quickly showing how is it that we were able to go about creating these campaigns, why would this be beneficial, and how I did that. From a conclusions perspective, the first question that I figured I would probably get is, did you submit these to VirusTotal? Because I think whenever I first started kind of talking about this research subject with individuals specifically in Intel, the first thing they said was they got nervous. rightly so. Because if these things if this type of file gets submitted to VirusTotal or somewhere else publicly, it can start to muddy the water very quickly. So from my perspective, I didn't submit anything to VirusTotal or publicly. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Because ultimately what it came down to is, I knew I was going to be giving this presentation. So if I gave the presentation and then someone went and found the binary in VirusTotal, it would make me look bad. So I didn't submit anything to VirusTotal. None of these files are public. However, if you want the files, message me and I'll be happy to provide them to you under the caveat you don't submit these publicly. And if you do, it's on you, not me. I didn't, I wasn't involved. Ultimately, from a conclusions perspective, this is kind of what I gathered. First, humans need to be involved in some fashion to filter out false positives and false negatives. And that comes from not just an attribution perspective, but also from a verdict perspective on the actual binaries or tools or malware that these groups are using, and also from a verdict perspective on the domains that they're leveraging for C2 infrastructure. So it's important that there has to be a human going through this and looking through these pieces of data. Obviously, be careful with attribution. I steer as far away of attribution as possible, so you obviously have to be careful. And I think I've demonstrated some of the rationale as to why you need to be careful over the past 50 minutes. Also, it's super important. Remember that confirmation bias exists, and that's not going away, especially on the Intel side. It's definitely not going away, and you have to be cognizant of that. Timing of domain re-registration should be looked at. Meaning, if a domain hasn't been registered for 2 years, and it was previously used by APT Group 28, for lack of a better example, the likelihood of that being an actor or the same actor group 2 years later is pretty slim. They've moved on to other infrastructure, they've moved on to other providers, they've moved on. So you have to pay attention to when those domain re-registrations occur, and you have to look at that with a grain of salt. As I mentioned earlier, all roads start and end at VirusTotal. If there's a file on there, there's going to be researchers that are going to be looking at it, especially if it triggers YARA rules. So just remember, you submit a file publicly, it's going to get looked at, more than likely. Also, you have to operate and feel comfortable in uncertainty, specifically whenever you're looking at attribution, and specifically when you're looking at cases like this, just because the amount of uncertainty that exists with attribution, correlating groups, actors, etc. And then finally, just from kind of a numbers perspective, going back to my original objectives, looking at speed and cost as my two main objectives or two main priorities. Ultimately, it cost me $24 to run all three of these operations. That includes domain registrations, that includes other stuff as well. I won't go into detail on that. Monthly cost roughly would be calculated about $20 to $25 per campaign. Again, that includes infrastructure, etc. And I'm keeping that as a very small number just based on the simple fact that you're likely not going to be going out and creating false flag efforts for 30 different people or 30 different groups or malware families, etc. The fastest time that I was get to weaponization, meaning from the time that I found an indicator to the time in which I was actually weaponized and created the binary and everything else, was about 20 minutes. So that's the time that it took for me to find an indicator, register the domain, create the malware, and have the end result testing it against our signatures, testing it against IDS, IBS, all the signatures that we have. And then finally, industry blogs serve as a great source for false flag information sourcing. The idea behind this talk wasn't necessarily to tell you how to create a false flag effort. The idea behind the talk was to give you an idea of what, from a threat research perspective, we look at and how we group this activity, and then how attribution can be called into question simply by running some generic tools and quickly generating this stuff. I appreciate everybody's time. I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, everybody. So we have a few minutes. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand. We'll have a mic runner come out and grab you. If you can just wait for the mic, though, that'd be fantastic so they can get it on the recording.
Hi. Awesome presentation. And you talk about the cost that was involved for you to do this research. what would be your suggestion for small companies or maybe a startup to invest on the cyber research part, where they are not doing right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, from a small organization perspective, what do I recommend doing to kind of assist in, I guess, avoiding some of this, right? Realistically, what this comes down to is everything that I was creating from a binary perspective as well as from a domain perspective would have been caught as malicious, meaning they were properly identified as malicious, both the domain and the binary itself. So if you had compensating controls in place, AV, IPS, all the traditional stuff, this would have been caught. The difference being the attribution to that binary and the command and control infrastructure would have been what was thrown off. Not necessarily if it was malicious or not. This is more on the attribution side, and think of it as like the metadata tagging side of saying this is actor group A, this is malware family B. So it would have been caught in your organization, more than likely. This is more related to kind of the attribution side. So you just would have missed that piece of it, not necessarily the fact that plugins would have been running rampant through your environment.
Excellent. Any other questions? Yes. I'll let you use my mic.
Hi, thanks for giving this talk. Do you think there's some possibility for a big, let's say like a nation state level actor to you said yourself, this was a pretty low resource sort
Absolutely.
of operation. Could they just do tons of this, right?
Absolutely.
And just
if
make so busy the industry that their real stuff slips through.
Absolutely. Let's put it this way. If I were on that side of the fence, that's something that I would be looking at, to muddy the water as much as possible, especially given knowing how researchers look at that data. It's easy then to be able to say, yes, you could create massive false flag efforts on covering a multitude of different groups and very easily muddy the waters. Absolutely. And I think that that's probably something that's looked at.
Excellent. Any other questions? All right, everybody.
Awesome.
Kyle.
Thank you.